In the first part, the three main references were dated 1939, 1960, 1963. For this second reference, the main reference is dated July 2016. It is a paper that I contribute to the volume of economic theory in honor of Bernard. And I will go quickly, Bernard Corneille, I will go quickly over the model which you find technically more rigorous in the economic theory publication, but the economic theory publication does not include an interpretation and application, and that will be my main purpose today. I have referred to temporary general equilibrium models before. I will add some new elements. The first one being money. Now, in the 2016 paper just referred to, there is a fiat money and a bank. The bank, of course, is abstract for a banking sector. Many aspects of the model are simple expressions that are readily generalizable. And the agents, firms, and households may hold cash, which is modeled in the form of deposits earning no interest at the bank. They may engage in short-term borrowing, and they may engage in bond trading. Short-term borrowing is overdrafts on the bank account with interest charges at a rate are set by the bank. And there is a general transactions technology. The most popular transactions technology is cash in advance. Here, the technology is much more general. The only requirement is continuity with respect to the volume of transactions, and that's it. Now, the first problem in a temporary equilibrium model with incomplete markets is to introduce decision criteria for the firms. Under complete markets, one says the firm maximizes profits. If it is at market prices, all you need is a computer in which you feed the production set and let the computer make the production decisions. But in the incomplete market model, there is no well-defined present value of the profits of the firm. The temporary equilibrium model started with the work of Diamond and Radner in the 60s with a model where the only assets that you can use to transfer resources from today until tomorrow, and from tomorrow with a different distribution across states of the environment. That model of Diamond and Radner had only assets and the bonds. A special case would have so many different firms with so different production plans that the returns to the asset could span the state space. That would require to have anticipated profit vectors in the different states, forming a matrix of full rank. If you have a continuum of states, that's out of question. And in the world that we have today, it is felt that we are quite far from having enough assets, enough for the firms to be able to associate a present value with vectors of future profits. So they will have to evaluate these vectors of future profits somehow, how being the subject of the question, what is the more reasonable decision criteria for firms. Now, in approaching this problem, it is natural to start with the notion of constraint feasible and constraint efficient allocations. An allocation is constraint feasible, allocation being a set of consumption vectors for all the agents today, and tomorrow a set of production vectors for the firms. It is constraint feasible if it is physically feasible, as we discussed an hour ago, but also implementable through the available assets, here through the portfolios of shares and bonds. That is constraint feasible in the sense of relevant for this model. The notion of feasible here is not physical, it is the possibility of forming today a portfolio that makes tomorrow's consumption accessible. And over the constraint feasible set, one can define constraint Pareto efficiency. And then I'll refer to a theorem of 1974, so I'm still way before 216, which gives a necessary condition for a set of production plans and portfolios of assets to be part of a constraint Pareto efficient allocation. If it is not the case, then you should be able, by modifying the production plans and the shareholdings, to make everybody at least as well off and some better off. And what conditions do we have? For each firm J, one defines a shadow value for the production plan that is a set of shadow prices at which this production plan should be optimal. And these shadow prices, beta JS for firm J and state S, are weighted averages of shadow prices for the households. Now, a shadow prices for a household regarding state S is simply the marginal rate of substitution between resources today and resources tomorrow in state S. And if the households have preferences representable by utility functions and are convex, there will be such prices. And a necessary condition for efficiency of the production plans given the portfolios is that the production plan should be optimal at shadow prices obtained as weighted averages of the shadow prices of the shareholders. This is understandable? So?
Did you drop incompleteness of the preferences now?
This theorem, 1974, assumes that all constrained feasible allocations come into account, and among these you can define constrained Pareto efficient, so the preferences of the household must be complete enough for Pareto efficiency to be well defined. In the publication of 74, it is assumed that preferences are complete, representable by expected utility, differentiable utility, etc. But the condition can be generalized to somewhat more broad assumptions. Let me illustrate. Suppose we talk about a firm which has a single shareholder. Then the criterion of 74 says let the single shareholder maximize her or his expected utility by choice of the production plan. That is intuitive, no? That a single owner, like a local grocery store in a village, will take risks according to the preferences of the owner. Now, the second part of the necessary condition is that the portfolios should be optimal given the production plans. That's intuitive enough, no problem. Now, what is a problem is the fact that this necessary condition is not sufficient. And the reason why it is not sufficient is obvious enough. You see as determinant of the profits a term which involves status and wise, both of which are endogenous variables. We are talking about the choices of production plans and portfolios. So you have a maximand, including the product of two endogenous variables. So this maximand is convex instead of being concave, and the first order condition is not sufficient. One easy remark would be you could change simultaneously the production plans and the portfolios at a global advantage. The definition in the characterization of efficiency consists of two parts, one about the production plans, the other about the portfolios, but no joint condition involving both. And we are not interested in that really, because we want to let the firms offer shares on the market reflecting certain production plans, and we want to let households and investment funds and the like buy shares given the firm program. We don't want to impose joint decisions about both portfolios and shares. The single owner is the special case where this is natural. So let us consider alternatives to the single shareholder. With several shareholders, you could implement the 74 conditions by having the partners agree on the production plan of the firm, more generally agree on the policy of the firm, perhaps with some transfers or compensation among them, which may take various forms. But more difficult is the problem which arises in joint stock companies. And for joint stock companies, I did in the 80s develop a model which aims at being in line with practice, namely a board of directors and an assembly of shareholders that meets rarely for special occasions or reasons. And in that work of the 80s, it is assumed that given the identity of the shareholders, a production plan is preferred to another only if it is by all directors and the majority of shareholders. This is completely different from the approach which is maybe more popular, although questioned by many, where one assumes that firms have all the information needed to take Pareto efficient decisions. And that calls for the assumption that firms know the preferences not just of their own shareholders, but of all potential shareholders, so as to solve the joint problem of a best production plan and the shareholders for whom it is best. The condition there is, I think, fairly realistic. Still, I do not want to impose it. Clearly, if you look at single owner, small firms, partnership, joint stock companies, multinationals, you must be able to handle a wide variety of decision procedures, decision criteria, and valuations of future profits. So I will simply assume that the preferences among production plans of the firms, preferences of the firm itself, are not complete and are only weakly convex and continuous, using the same formulation that I introduced an hour ago for the consumers. And that is a minimal requirement. But it is sufficient to prove existence of equilibria. And I regard it as a useful contribution of this 2016 paper that it extends the analysis of existence of temporary equilibria to much weaker assumption about the preferences of the households and the firms. We'll see tomorrow whether my discussants agree with that statement. That will be of interest, at least to me. Now, I will now explain how price and wage rigidities are linked to market incompleteness and uncertainty by referring to minimum wages, fixed costs, and Kinky perceived demand curves. And then I will evoke how aggregate demand is related, and the equality of savings and investment in particular is related to market incompleteness. So that's what I just announced. I evoked 5 minutes ago the possibility that you could improve on an equilibrium of shares and production plans through simultaneous adjustment. There is something akin if you look at production plans and wages. Many firms offer to their employees uncertain prospects of future employment. Today, the suppliers of Caterpillar are a good example of firms who must confess to their employees that their jobs tomorrow, day after tomorrow, may have to be forgotten. There exists a literature on implicit labor contracts, which looks at the implications of this observation and essentially studies conditions under which a firm contracts with its employees that if tomorrow it uses the labor of only a fraction of them, 90%, fine, 50% maybe, then there will be a random choice of those who work and those who do not work, but they will all collect from the firm the same compensation. So it's a form of mutual insurance between the firm and its employees to share the risks. Naturally, the fact that everybody is compensated even when employment is well below implies that the wages will be less, and the contract stipulates that the employees will accept to work for lower wages, knowing that their colleagues who are not working are collecting the same. That's quickly summarized the theory of implicit labor contracts. It's an interesting theory, but it does not apply to prospective workers. There are many prospective workers, not many in this room today, but on a typical day, it is full of students who are prospective workers and who face uncertainty about what the labor market conditions will be when they look for a job. And for them, and of course many others, like those who are fired by Caterpillar, etc., it is important to take into account that they face uncertainties and to wonder how these uncertainties could be alleviated and ideally shared with the rest of the population inside the aggregate national income, which according to Borg is the relevant reference. So downwards wage rigidities coupled with unemployment benefits enable limiting the risks borne by workers, prospective employees, and lead to Pareto improvements if the loss of productive efficiency is more than compensated by the gain in risk-sharing efficiency. This is a sentence, I think, almost verbatim taken from a paper by Jacques DREZE and Christian Gaulier, published in 1993. And it is also interesting to realize, of course, that unemployment benefits are very difficult to administer in the absence of minimum wages. That's another reason. So the first the first example of second best efficient wage rigidities is risk sharing for the benefit of prospective workers. Another instance linked to incomplete markets concerns fixed costs. Of course, fixed cost means non-convexities in production, and there are many results in economics that have not been extended to these non-convexities, and there are research challenges there. One case where fixed costs have been handled successfully is known as peak load pricing, work done at Électricité de France in the 50s. A firm producing and distributing electricity must be able to cope with variations of quantities during the calendar year. Much less electricity consumed in summer than in winter, during vacations, weekends, and whatnot. And the way a major producer like Électricité de France meets these demands is by operating a variety of plants, some of which have high fixed costs and low marginal costs, and are operated throughout. But for the short periods of peak demand, you use instead gas turbines, which have low fixed cost but higher marginal cost. You sell them at the higher marginal costs. And the higher prices cover part of the fixed cost of the big plants. Now, this is for temporal variations where things average out, but the same problem arises with uncertain future outputs, and it is natural that you meet the uncertainty about future outputs by operating a variety of plants. But then, in order to cover the fixed costs of the big low marginal cost plants, you must transfer profits from one state to another. It's no longer from one season or one day to another, but it's across alternative future realizations. You can do that if you have complete markets for assets, but if you don't, then you must cover the fixed cost state by state, which entails lower bounds on selling prices. So fixed costs are a source of price rigidities under incomplete markets, a source that would not arise with complete markets. Another interesting case concerns kinky perceived demand curves. It's a very simple proposition that kinks may arise in perceived demand by firms which are not competitive firms taking prices as given, but monopolistic firms choosing their prices with due attention to the price elasticity of demand. There are in the literature different papers, in particular by Sweezy and Stiglitz and others, to explain how kinky demand curves may come about. Now, one very simple situation is if a firm is uncertain about the elasticity of demand. And I guess that many firms which set prices are in that situation. So there is a distribution of possible elasticities for price raising, and there is one for price lowering. And if the firm is risk averse, the certainty equivalents are not the same, and you get a kink in the perceived demand curve. That argument can be found in a paper of mine in 1979. It has been invoked also in more recent work on kinky perceived demand curves, in particular a paper of 2008 by Jacques DREZE and Jean-Jacques Herrings, based on work of Negishi. So I will not enter into the details, but if you are interested, you can find that paper. So there are a number of reasons linked specifically to market incompleteness that explain price rigidities. We must be interested in temporary equilibrium models with price rigidities. And before coming to the theorem, one last remark, again linking price rigidities. We think about uncertainty affecting the economy adversely in terms of bad shocks, like an oil shock, like a real estate disorder, etc. But we should also learn to work with the fact that uncertainty in itself, not adverse shock, uncertainty in itself may have adverse effects on the economy, and in particular, under incomplete markets again, uncertainty will affect savings and investment in opposite directions. Meaning, if we become more uncertain today, this will take savings away from investment. If they were equal, a gap will occur. If they were not equal, the gap will increase if it was too much savings, too little investment. How do we know that? Well, there is a literature going back far away. For me, the first new result I thought I was establishing was with Franco Modigliani in 1954 about the implications of uncertainty of future income on current savings. The first thing we realized and demonstrated easily was that future uncertainty is affecting a consumer more adversely than current uncertainty. Because with future uncertainty, you have to make decisions under uncertainty, whereas with current uncertainty, when the uncertainty is resolved, you make your decisions. And I will not spell out the details, but it is easily verified that under standard preferences, if you face future resources that become more uncertain, this will generally result in higher savings. Not necessarily. It is not a universal property, but it is very general. A sufficient condition is called increasing absolute risk tolerance. No time to go into these things, but it is generally accepted that more uncertainty about future resources induces to save more, and similarly, one should expect that more uncertainty about the future leads firms to postpone investment, possibly abandon them, but to postpone because, and here I refer to the book by Dixit and Pendyke, an investment project should be implemented, not when it is profitable, but only when investing today is more profitable than doing so tomorrow, after observing whatever you will learn tomorrow. All right, so let me then turn to the existence theorem. You can find the details in Economic Theory, July 2016. We are talking about a temporary equilibrium which consists of a tree with a state today and alternatives tomorrow, the alternatives tomorrow being subtrees. Agents are households and firms, commodities today or tomorrow, we don't spell out what occurs later, money with the transactions technology, as I explained a minute ago. The assets are the shares of the firms, the bonds, and also the shares of the bank, which are not traded in that model. There are spot markets at time zero, with prices PL0 for commodities, pi j for the shares of firm J, 5 for the bonds, and there are quantity constraints for the commodities where you have price rigidities. The case treated is in the paper that I am referring to, being downwards price or wage rigidities. So the quantity constraints faced by individual agents, households not finding work, firms not being able to sell to full capacity, they are faced with quantity constraints which are treated formally in the model through determinants labeled sigma time zero. Oh yes, there is still something to say. When? So one defines the temporary equilibrium by stating that it consists of decision rules for the households and the firms with well-defined immediate components, the H0, the J0. An equilibrium specifies what these decisions are, and then we have a set of signals, the price vector, the interest rate of the bank, the prices of shares, the price of bonds, the signals for the quantity constraints and the profits of the bank. And an equilibrium requires that the household decisions be efficient in the sense that the feasible set and the preferred set do not intersect. In other words, there is no better consumption plan identified as better consumption plan which satisfies the budget constraint and the feasibility conditions. Firm decisions, again, should be feasible and optimal for the firms under the assumptions that the firms have preference correspondences, not complete preferences, only weak convexity, but that defines whether or not chosen decision could be improved and equilibrium concept says no, could not be improved. Then you have market clearing for bonds, for shares, and for commodities, and you have the condition on rationing that if the prices are not at their lower limit, there is no rationing. Rationing only comes in when the price constraint is binding. Yes?
How much of this quantity, this rationing results depends on downward energy?
Can you speak in?
So, how much of your rationing result depend on this downward wage rigidity? Because it looks to me here that basically, if I translate in very rough terms of a macroeconomist, is that you have a discrepancy between saving and investment, which is driven by uncertainty, and this has some real effects, basically because you have wage rigidity, real wage rigidity, right? So, am I correct? Does it hinges on wage rigidity, or there is some other ways that I'm not understanding here, in which uncertainty really drives this rationing result?
Now, this is an abstract general theorem. It allows for price rigidities with quantity constraint when the price rigidity is not binding. It allows for a discrepancy between savings and investment at the zero lower bound, but an equilibrium will impose equality of savings and investment, so that the existence theorem says there exists equilibria with these properties. And I think the answer you await is that if the theorem is correct, is it? You don't need negative real rates to obtain an equilibrium. You can obtain it by a lower level of overall activity under which savings equal investment. That answers your question?
Wage rigidity is determined.
Now, the rigidities that come in here are for period zero defined ex ante. So the minimum wage, say, prevailing this fall is inherited. And whatever it is, there will exist equilibria with certain properties. An existence theorem is a strange animal in a sense, and if you are familiar with it and use it, you run the risk of forgetting that it is a strange animal. And if you are not familiar with it, you look at a strange animal and you don't know what. And I'll spend basically the rest of this lecture interpreting what is now on the board. Not yet, no, the theorem is coming. But if you ask the question, are wage rigidities needed to obtain an equilibrium if we are allowed to adjust overall activity so as to equate savings and investment? The answer is no. If we look for an equilibrium where savings are equal to investment, we'll find one. And I'll explain in a couple of minutes how to understand that. Okay, so here comes the theorem, but to read...
So, Jacques, is there any decision that is taken in period 2, or everything is determined in period 0? I mean, in the next period, is everything determined in period 0?
So we have defined an equilibrium. Where is the... Yes, the market variables refer to period 0. The quantity constraints refer to period 0. The production plans cover the future. But they are not explicit in the signals. The agents may have expectations about future production that differ across agents and that are different from those held by the firm in choosing its plan. Does that answer your question, or?
So that means that after uncertainty is solved, they have to adjust. I mean, what they do is not exactly what they expected before.
Because the expectations about future signals, so you will have the future signals, differ across individuals. They cannot all be realized. You ask an employee of a firm working for Caterpillar, do you expect to be employed through the whole year 2017? Some may say yes, others may say no. And that, of course, we will not know until tomorrow. And much of the uncertainty that we are faced with is impossible to eliminate today. That is why economists must be concerned with uncertainty every day, every night, if they dream about economics.
So, the definition of an equilibrium is really about what is going on today.
The equilibrium concerns today's decisions of households and firms, which include today's transactions and activities and so on, and today's purchases of assets. What more do you want? You want to have more future markets.
No, but of course tomorrow there needs to be adjustment.
Of course.
This is not in the definition.
And when you say tomorrow there will be adjustments, that will be the center of my lecture tomorrow. So, but in your life today, in the life of your friends, what is missing? What should be part of the model describing our economy? You'll tell me tomorrow.
No, but I simply that a set of decision rules with period zero components might suggest that you must specify the other decisions. So the decision rules about what is not decided today. That was a simple clarification I wanted to address.
Well, in the classical analysis of temporary equilibrium, you know when the concept of temporary equilibrium first appeared? 1937, before Vickrey. What was I going to say?
I think it's clear.
You have agents making decisions translated today into work, purchases, portfolios, whatnot, based on what they observe today, what they hear today, or see on TV or where else, or read in regards économiques. And they form anticipations which guide their decisions. But what is at stake in describing the state of the economy today is not these individual anticipations, it is the observable decisions. But we'll come.
There's a rational expectation there. So there is that plans that is optimal from equilibrium there may not be what will be realized next year.
Rational expectations, do we mean a la Muse, John Muse? Means what? That the expectations of the economic agents are compatible with observables and with economic theory. Nothing in there says that they have to be common to all agents, correct, single-valued, as is assumed in some models. Here we are talking about existence of an equilibrium today for the observables of today, which are the consumption, production, transaction, asset prices.
Does your equilibrium concept contain commitments? Typically firm decisions implying investment, which are for the long period. Is it a concept implicit, the notion of commitment that investment will be done?
This is a model of incomplete markets. So there may be commitments and there may not. And in particular, if you think about employment commitments, there may be some in one firm and not in the next.
No, but I'm thinking of capital decisions, like purchasing machines or constructing machines or projects which may last several years.
Indeed, and firms may, in this model, make commitments which need not be realistic in all states. Here, a firm could decide to start an investment today that will be completed tomorrow and will require funding for completion. But nothing guarantees that these decisions are realistic. And of course, we know that firms make decisions that, under adverse circumstances, will lead to bankruptcy. And
that will occur in period 1 then.
Now, I have a comment in 5 minutes on a major defect of this model being that it does not make room for debts at the start. The assumption is that bond holdings are equal to zero at the opening of the economy. There will be bond transactions in the first period, but these bond transactions will be exchange of cash for a promise of cash tomorrow. There is no room there for bankruptcy today. And in anticipation of a comment that was to come later, it is a major weakness of this model that it does not make room for financial liabilities as part of the primitives. All right, I have not yet read the theorem, and in order to do that, one needs to understand two definitions. One is very easy, the current inflation rate, which is simply translating the overall price level in terms of yesterday. And a measure of the output gap, which is a rate of excess supply.
What is PL minus 1?
Yesterday's price for commodity L. If you want to know what was the price of a pound of tomatoes yesterday, you would have to remember. But of course, there exist price indices, and there was a price index yesterday, which is on record, and the price index for today can be related to that of yesterday, thereby defining an inflation rate. Or alternatively, you can record directly whether certain prices rise or fall and compute an average. You have a problem with defining inflation operationally?
What is exogenous? I'm just asking, it seems to me that PL minus 1 is not part of the model, so what you call inflation rate is basically an index of the price level today at this state 0.
So this inflation rate is a comparison between today and yesterday, it is assumed that yesterday's prices are observed. It is not spelled out, it is not an explicit assumption, but it is part, of course, of all the data that are implicitly assumed now in our models.
And they enter into the anticipation, into the expectations. This is
for tomorrow.
Yes.
Today's rate of inflation.
It's not arbitrary.
May, of course, affect the anticipation for inflation between today and tomorrow, but they are not explicit anywhere, the expected inflation. That's part of the anticipations. But I think I should be conscious that time is moving. So there is the inflation rate, which is assumed computable in spite of the many reservations that sophisticated economists might have on this point. And there is an average underutilization rate, which is computed essentially as a weighted mean of unemployment rates and underutilization of capacity rates. And in the paper you will find a technical definition, but for today's purpose it is enough to think about this U bar being a measure of the output gap, including both labor and production capacities. And then you have this theorem, which refers back to the weak assumptions that underlie it, and which says, look at the product of the rate of utilization of U bar is the output gap. So 1 minus U bar is the rate of utilization of labor and capital average and index. Multiply that by 1 plus I0. Whatever the value of this product, there exists a temporary equilibrium that verifies it. Talk. Now, there are many, many things to say about this theorem. I have 10 points of interpretation on my slides, and 15 minutes to go, 10 maybe. So there will be, I am sure, some discussion tomorrow by the discussants. Let me go fairly quickly over these various points. Do not ask clarifications at once, because maybe you are asking about point number 7 when I'm still at the start, but at the end of the 10 points. First point, we studied a temporary equilibrium model inspired by general equilibrium theory. General equilibrium theory is regarded as microeconomics, but the theorem is stated in terms of macroeconomic variables. Am I right in saying that this is the first time that an existence theorem in general equilibrium theory is formulated in purely macro terms. If you know an exception, be sure to let me know. I have been claiming for many years that it was more promising to study the macro implications of microeconomics than the micro foundations of macroeconomics. So you realize, of course, that I was delighted to be able to formulate the theorem in this way. Now, what does this theorem say? It does not say that today's temporary equilibrium could be anything and is arbitrary. It doesn't say that, and that would be nonsense. It simply says that if all the conditions are met, it is an equilibrium, and therefore there is no endogenous mechanism of change. It's an equilibrium. If there are forces inducing change, they must either be part of the implicit primitives which are not spelled out, or they must be brought about by policies. Now, the fact that there exist many possibilities for today means, of course, that there is scope for policies. Today's equilibrium could be different. Not saying it could be anything, but if yesterday's policy had been different, if this morning's news were different, the equilibrium could be different. So we are asserting it is an equilibrium with no endogenous mechanism calling for change, which would be the case if the equilibrium conditions were not satisfied. For instance, if there was an excess demand for dinner at nulle part ailleurs. Okay? And of course, the next step should be to introduce dynamics, because there are implicit forces apt to modify the equilibrium so that tomorrow's temporary equilibrium is different from today's. It may be different for exogenous reasons. It may be different because certain decisions have been made today that will have implications tomorrow, and we will talk tomorrow about macroeconomic policies that would change the equilibrium today. So there is still a scope for macroeconomics beyond what is implied by this theorem 7.1. The source of multiplicity is basically the possibility of different expectations. There is incidentally a paper of Yves Balasco who proves uniqueness of a temporary equilibrium, but hastens to say, this is because I have assumed given expectations with certain properties. If you vary these expectations, you vary the equilibrium. So we are in agreement there. All right. right? So that's the source of multiplicity. About the expectations, the economic information is of two kinds. One kind is the asset prices today, and the other kind is statistics, analysis, and whatnot. Of course, the stock prices should also reflect the information contained in statistics and publications and whatnot, because the agents, and in particular the professionals among them, may use this information. We referred a minute ago to rational expectations à la muse. Rational expectations à la muse assume that all the agents have the economic knowledge available today. And I think that there should be room for a new look at asset prices with Theorem 7.1 in the background. I mentioned this as a research challenge. You are welcome to look at it. Now, an important remark, 737, is that the theorem allows for two distinct trade-offs between inflation and unemployment. As you know, there are in the literature distinct trade-offs. There is a Phillips curve, which says that unemployment and inflation move in opposite direction. And there is an alternative theory of stagflation, which says they move in the same direction, obviously with capacity utilization, or if you wish, employment rate on the horizontal line and unemployment rate. That is not what I wanted to show. I wanted to show underutilization of resources and inflation. But this is the Phillips curve, of course, yes. And one sees that the movement from one year to the next can be in almost any direction. In addition, but the importance of the point, it can allow for Phillips curve or for stagflation, means the microeconomic foundations that are embodied in this concept of temporary equilibrium do not single out either the models with a Phillips curve or the models with stagflation. Or one could say, in the analysis of Barrow-Grossman, Malenvaux, and others, there should be room for classical unemployment or Keynesian unemployment, and so on. So the theorem, in my view, asserts that the micro foundations do not fully specify the macroeconomic models, and one should be open to a family of different models. So, an interesting question in that respect, of course, is would additional markets reduce the scope for alternative equilibria? And one example is the so-called missing indexed bonds puzzle. Why isn't there trade in bonds indexed on national income or national income per capita? Interestingly, there was at the stock exchange in Chicago trading in bonds indexed on national income, but these markets were closed down after 6 months because there was too little trading to cover the cost. Now, I claim that it is interesting to relate this theorem to a concept known as secular stagnation. Is secular stagnation a well-known concept or literature? Who knows about it? So, you can read about secular stagnation, but the bottom line was already stated in 1939. That was a good year for economics. By Hansen, who, remember, in 1939, the situation was somewhat comparable as the situation of today. There was a major crisis 10 years old that was not yet resolved. Now it is 8 years old instead of 10. But Hansen thought that the economic future could feature sick recoveries which die in their infancy and depressions which feed on themselves. So, Theorem 7.1 says a temporary equilibrium, if it contains underutilization of resources, can continue unless policies change it or unless the expectations change. Next comment is about the zero lower bound. I mentioned that before, so I don't repeat it, but I regard it as a research challenge to extend tâtonnement and non-tâtonnement processes of price adjustment to economies with a zero lower bound on interest rate. I have not talked about adjustment processes leading to equilibria for the kind of economies considered here. There exist such results. I have myself 2 papers, and others in this room are also concerned. One is with Jacques. I am not aware of any analysis of the working of a tâtonnement process on prices in an economy with a zero lower bound on the interest rate. There exist results for economies with downwards price rigidities, but the zero lower bound is still something a little bit different. So I now come to two very important remarks. The first one I have basically made already, namely that the least acceptable assumption underlying Theorem 7.1 is the assumption that initial endowments are in the interior of the consumption set. In other words, that every individual may live without work or exchange. And we shall talk tomorrow about how policies should be concerned with this. Clearly, we need policies of minimum wages, of allocations to poor people. Some people would claim a universal allocation. That is very different from seeing to it that everyone can survive. So this assumption will need to be revived. And the other remark concerns the fact that we do not have debts among the primitives of the model, and we should definitely allow for negative debts at the start in the same way that we implicitly allow for implicit debts later on. So my last PowerPoint is a list of research challenges and a teaching challenge. Extend the model of Theorem 1 to fixed cost increasing returns in perfect competition. That's obvious. Study additional assets. Study more expectations. And the teaching challenge